We have heard some stories about reincarnation where a person dies, and then another person who is born claims to be that person who has already died. But today's case is a bit different. It is considered one of the few scientifically proven cases of reincarnation. But is it really a reincarnation? Or could it be possession? Welcome to another video on the channel. If you enjoy our content, subscribe, give it a like. And at the end of the video, share your opinion on the topic. Without further ado, let's get to the case. The case I bring today happened in India, in December 1984, in a small village in the northern part of India. There was a teenage girl named Sumitra, and she was already married. However, she lived in this very poor village, so she had some more basic customs. The people who lived in that city lived in mud huts with thatched roofs. There was no electricity. Nobody went to school, and Sumitra, even though she had learned a few things, knew very little about reading and writing, just the basics, like being able to write her name, but that was it. Since childhood, she suffered a lot from loneliness because her mother passed away shortly after Sumitra was born. As a result, her father, who was now taking care of the daughter alone, spent a lot of time working, as he was the only person working to provide for the family. So she lived without very close company. Sumitra's husband, after they got married, traveled a lot for work. So when she became pregnant with her first child, she was very happy. She felt that she finally had the company she had longed for. After her son was born, she did everything with him in her arms. She cooked, cleaned the house and performed household chores with one hand, while holding her son with the other. Everyone in the village knew her and the new baby, who was greatly pampered by everyone there. Sumitra had a habit of walking from her house to a water well in the village to fetch water to bring home. During this journey, everyone would greet her, play with the child, and she finally felt very happy and fulfilled. However, one day, in early 1985, when her son was a few months old, she was making the same journey she was so accustomed to when something happened. As she was walking with a bucket to fetch water in one hand and her son in the other, she stopped, motionless, as if she had frozen. She let the bucket fall to the ground, attracting the attention of those around her. They noticed her strange behavior, and suddenly, she became very rigid, her fingers bent backward with great force, as if they were about to break. Soon, the baby began to cry in her arms. One of the villagers took the baby in an attempt to ask Sumitra what was happening, if she was okay. But she couldn't respond. It seemed like she was in a trance, but in reality, she was having some kind of seizure. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she started grinding her teeth, very forcefully. People could see her jaw moving, but there was nothing they could do to help, except wait for the seizure to pass. The commotion, especially with a crying baby, attracted a large crowd to see what was happening, especially in such a small village where not much happened throughout the day. Just as suddenly as Sumitra entered this state, she also came out of it. She shook her head, realizing there was a crowd around her. Confused, she saw her crying son, picked him up again, and not understanding what had happened, she just took the bucket from the ground and resumed her path, fetched the water, and went back home. Sumitra tried to think that it was just an isolated episode, as she was very tired and had some insomnia after having the baby. So, it was probably stress, and it wouldn't happen again. She didn't even mention it to her husband or the rest of the family, but unfortunately, these seizures continued to occur. The second time it happened, she was found by her father-in-law while she was in the kitchen with her eyes rolled back and her hands also bent backward. Her father-in-law tried to wake her up for about 10 minutes but without success. When Sumitra came to, she didn't remember anything that had happened. These episodes intensified to the point that she would fall into these trance states almost every day. But now it had become dangerous for her to take care of her own child. There was a risk that she might have a seizure while alone with him, and she could potentially harm him in a moment of carelessness when he could do something without her seeing. So, her son was rarely left alone with her now. The rest of the family had to mobilize to take care of the child, and at the end of these trances, she started saying things that didn't make sense. She would say all kinds of different things. Sometimes she screamed for help, sometimes she said her head was being crushed and she needed assistance. Suddenly, she would say that all she could see was darkness. And don't think her family didn't try to find some kind of healer or seek medical attention to see if she was suffering from any illness. Local healers couldn't identify anything wrong with Sumitra. She was in the peak of health on July 16, 1985. 6 months after these trances began. She said something different. She said she would die in 3 days. Of course, she became concerned when they told her that she had uttered those words. So, when the 3rd day arrived, she took great care not to do anything that could jeopardize her life. She didn't cook, she didn't go downstairs. She didn't walk anywhere that could have any kind of hole. She also stayed away from her son to ensure she wouldn't hurt him. And when the end of the day came, there was no sign that anything would happen to her. Everyone was relieved. At the time when her mother-in-law was preparing dinner, she decided to go out for some fresh air. As soon as she stepped out onto the street, she saw one of her friends on the other side and waved for them to come over and chat. While the friend was approaching Sumitra, she went into a trance again. She became rigid, her hands went backward, and her eyes rolled back in her head. However, this time, the trance was a bit different. Now she raised her arms slightly above her head and began scratching at something. Her breathing also became very heavy suddenly. Suddenly, she stopped scratching, placed her arms back at her sides, and returned to the initial position. She started making some small sounds from her mouth, which soon dissipated. When her friend approached, she noticed that despite Sumitra standing, she wasn't breathing anymore. The friend started screaming for help, and her family came out of the house. Her husband also came out and called the healers to check what was happening. They brought Sumitra inside, and the healer began to examine her, checking her pulse, looking into her eyes, examining her mouth. After a few minutes, he said she was dead. Of course, this news shocked the entire family. Her husband collapsed and began to cry, just like the rest of the family. In this village, it was crucial to treat the body quickly when someone died. Afterward, they performed some Hindu rituals before cremating the body. So, some villagers started the procedures for the ritual. Meanwhile, her mother-in-law and other family members applied essential oils to the body. The funeral pyre was prepared, and one of the villagers was combing Sumitra's hair before dressing her for cremation. She noticed something different. Despite Sumitra's closed eyes, she could sense something moving underneath, as if her eyes were looking from side to side. She was in shock and couldn't speak a word. Others around also began to notice, and suddenly, Sumitra simply took a deep breath. She had been without a heartbeat for 45 minutes and suddenly came back to life as if nothing had ever happened. Of course, the medical knowledge in that village wasn't highly advanced. So it's hard to confirm if she was truly without a heartbeat 100%. Maybe they were very weak. When Sumitra's husband saw that she had returned to life, he rushed to hug her. However, she seemed confused and angry, quickly pulling away from his embrace. The healer advised him to give her some time since she had just undergone a significant trauma. She seemed not to understand what had happened. She was taken home to rest, sleep, and wake up the next day to talk to everyone. The healer, despite confirming her good health, decided to visit again the next day to see if her health remained the same. When she woke up and felt better, she didn't want to be near her husband or in-laws. She appeared not to recognize her son and started asking for names that nobody knew. She kept insisting that this wasn't her family, and neither was it her home. Over the next 3 months, the family became extremely worried. Suspecting that Sumitra had some kind of mental illness, schizophrenia, paranoia. They tried various procedures and the villagers were gossiping. After all, it was strange for someone to predict their own death. die for a while, and come back as if not recognizing anyone and not knowing where she was. She underwent various rituals, exorcisms, and people claimed she was possessed, but nothing seemed to work. She continued asking to see certain people, insisting that this wasn't her family. She even tried to run away from home to reach the place she claimed was her real home. She had some customs that were different from those of the people in the village. It seemed like she had a somewhat higher class because suddenly she could read and write perfectly. And she refused to do simple household tasks like washing dishes. She also stopped walking barefoot and now only wore sandals. After 3 frustrating months for the family, a man knocked on their door. During these 3 months, Sumitra had the habit of writing a lot. Frustrated that nobody believed her, she wrote several letters and sent them to people that nobody in the family knew. She mentioned names and surnames that nobody understood. Then this man arrived, claiming to be Ram Sia Tripathi. As soon as he arrived at the family's house, Sumitra ran towards him and hugged him. She said her name was Shiva and that she had been killed by her sister-in-law. But who was this Shiva Tripathi? She was born in 1962 in a Brahmin family. Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, who was the man at Sumitra's house, was a university professor. Shiva grew up, went to university, and graduated in domestic economics. At 18, she married a man named Chidi Lal and moved to his family's house in another city. The couple had 2 children nicknamed Rinku and Tinku. Shiva didn't get along well with her in-laws. They were reportedly irritated by her higher education and more urban habits. Additionally, the family considered her dowry insufficient and often complained about it verbally. The situation worsened in May 1985 when her in-laws prohibited her from attending a family wedding. On May 18, her maternal uncle visited the family to say that Shiva had gone to his house crying because she had been beaten by her mother-in-law and sister-in-law. The next morning, the uncle learned that Shiva's corpse had been found on train tracks near the city. The in-laws claimed she threw herself in front of the train, but when the body was discovered, it was intact except for a head wound. According to Shiva's sister, when they first saw the body, the head was crushed, and the brain was exposed. The uncle requested a delay in Shiva's cremation until her father could come to the city. However, when he traveled to bring her parents, the in-laws obtained permission to cremate the body earlier. There were also rumors in the city that some people had seen her in-laws carrying the body to the train station. When Tripathi arrived in the city, his daughter's body was just ashes and bones. He reported the death to the police, who initiated an inquiry. Shiva's husband and father-in-law were arrested but later released due to lack of evidence. Her mother-in-law and sister-in-law went into hiding for months and were arrested once discovered. But they were eventually released due to insufficient evidence. Several newspapers published the news of this case. The question in this video was that Sumitra, who apparently had died, now showed traits of Shiva. Shiva's father also believed that Sumitra was her. He brought a family album and showed it to Sumitra, who recognized everyone by their name and surname. When this case came to light, various researchers and scholars decided to investigate to see if it was true. Up until now, everything was aligning. All the Shiva's family members who met Sumitra were recognizing her, despite having a different face and appearance. Shiva recognized her children and was delighted to have finally reunited with her family. She felt no love or affection for Sumitra's old family. In fact, she wanted nothing to do with them. A psychologist named Parmeshwar Dayal conducted an investigation and presented the results at a conference in India in 1987. He interviewed both Sumitra and the 2 families, asking people who knew both girls well to respond to questionnaires about their personalities. He also conducted the Rorschach test on Sumitra, analyzed the handwriting in 3 letters, 2 written by Shiva and 1 supposedly by Sumitra, and found that everything matched. There was a BBC documentary about this investigation. According to Sumitra's father, when she came back to life, or woke up, she seemed not to recognize the place or the people around her. She spoke very little during the day and, at night, began claiming to be Shiva. She repeated that she had been murdered by her in-laws in the city where she used to live, a city quite distant from the village. Sumitra's family claimed that they had no knowledge of this girl Shiva who had died during that time. The psychologist who presented the case mentioned that Sumitra, considered possessed, was cruelly tortured continuously for an extended period by exorcists and spiritual healers for redemption and cure. But it was all in vain. She remained in the persona of Shiva. Strangely, there were brief resurgences of Sumitra at times. Shiva would become confused and seem to revert to her normal personality. The psychologist also observed that, after waking up in Sumitra's body, Shiva claimed to have memories of the period between Shiva's death and this new awakening. She alleged that she had been taken to the Hindu god of death. According to her, she saw people with their feet turned backward, being punished according to their karma, some being whipped, others being thrown into boiling water. The goddess Santoshi Mata came to her aid, hiding her under the board on which Yama, the god of death, was seated and feeding her. After a few days, Sumitra begged for mercy from Yama, who agreed to send her back for another 7 years of life. The psychologist took care to confirm whether Sumitra's and Shiva's families had any contact, but besides belonging to different educational levels, they also belonged to different castes and had different lifestyles, one being more urban and the other more agricultural. They also wanted to compare Sumitra's or Shiva's statements with what was available in the newspaper, considering that some information about Shiva's murder was public. They managed to verify at least 19 correct statements from Shiva that were not publicly known. Some of the specific information that matched between Sumitra and Shiva included a specific yellow sari that Shiva owned, a watch she possessed, the box where it was kept in the Tripathi household before she got married and moved, the birth order of Shiva's maternal uncles, a loving nickname used by the family for Shiva, the names of 2 schools she attended, the nicknames of her 2 children, and the names of 2 friends. Now, you might be wondering, what happened here? Reincarnation, as we commonly hear about it, isn't supposed to work this way. A person is supposed to die, and then another child is born. It's not a swapping of souls within the same body, where one person dies, experiences a short coma, seizure, or death, and then comes back in the same body as someone else. It doesn't make any sense. So, some scholars examining this case proposed 3 different hypotheses, at least. One of them is a new form of reincarnation, as if there was a spiritual exchange happening. The second option is that Sumitra was possessed by the spirit of Shiva, explaining the moments of lucidity with Sumitra's personality but with Shiva being dominant. However, this hypothesis isn't considered very credible, as possession episodes usually have shorter durations. The third option is a multiple personality disorder in Sumitra, where she would have an alter ego as Shiva. However, the case remains a mystery because even if it were an alter ego, it doesn't make much sense for Sumitra to have all the information about Shiva, a person she never met, who had died, and who passed away on the same day Sumitra had this crisis or trance. James Matlock, a researcher on reincarnation, coined a term called replacement reincarnation for cases where one spirit permanently replaces another without the body dying. He notes that this situation often occurs after an illness, often a severe one, and only 2 age groups have been observed to experience something similar, commonly up to the age of 3 and more rarely, as in Sumitra's case, during adolescence. Until her death in 1998, Sumitra accepted that her name was now Shiva and lived the rest of her life as Shiva. This case was extensively investigated, and there are several interviews with Sumitra herself discussing her story. Sumitra's testimony helped solve the mysterious death of Shiva, providing crucial information that led to the identification and punishment of the culprits. I must confess, this case intrigues me a lot. It doesn't make sense to me. Even if it were a personality disorder, which might be a more plausible explanation. It's still bizarre that she had so much information about a person she barely knew, with specific and personal details not disclosed in the media. What do you think? Have you heard of anything similar? I'm quite familiar with reincarnation and related topics. But this is the first time I've come across such a case. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Also, I recommend watching a video on afterlife evidence. Thank you, and until next time.